I think this thing is going again. Today is New Year's Eve. This is December 31st, 1996. And it's about 4:15 in the afternoon. And so I thought probably maybe we could spend a little time together here and kind of review things. It's a cold day, very cold. It's only about 15 above. It snowed last night about, good 10 inches. Gee, it really snowed. Oh, my. Snowplows have been out all day. And there are good 4 or 5 foot drifts here in front of the house. Snowplows have been by. Neighbors been over to shovel me out. I haven't been out, but I mean they come over to shovel me out. And so it's a typical New Year's Eve. Now you might say, well, what am I going to do New Year's Eve? Well, the way it looks right now, I'll be alone. But I expect that because most people have a place to go for New Year's Eve. And now there's a possibility that my neighbor, Tom, and Kathy Adelsky will come over for a little while, but I talked to her on the phone a few minutes ago, and she said that her little daughter, who was only about 3 years old, wasn't feeling well. She thought, well, probably there might be a possibility they would just stay home, both she and her husband, Tom. Now, the last time we talked, on the calendar, according to the dad's diary here, we were at June 23, 1915. Wow. So, it says here, on June 24th, 1915, Helen Grambua married Robert Patzer. Now, Helen Grambua was the daughter of Ernest Grambua. Helen Grambua was the daughter of Ernest and married a fellow named Robert Patzer. And they had a big family of kids here in Roger City. Now, on the 25th, it said that he went to Cleese. Well, these names come in here every once in a while. Clee. Well, Clee was a good friend. They did a lot of fishing out here together. And then it said here, 1915, it says Otto came down to get a license. Now, you got to remember what that license was. And then we went to Metz. On the 7th of June, 1950, it says Osgood went to Long Rapids, Lachine, Hillman, and Alpena. Looking for business for the bank. And then on June 28th, it said went to a card party at Cleese. Of course, these people were very social people. They got together quite frequently. Then on the 29th, it says I took the train and went home. That meant he went to Metz. Met Louise and Bertha at Posen. Wow. And then also a Split girl and Leo Erleb. Now, the Splits were a very prominent family around Metz at that time. And Leo Erleb. Now, Leo Erleb, George, you remember him. He was the guy that we met on our trip out to Kansas, Nebraska, back in 1927. And when we came back, we came through Iowa, and he was a Lutheran minister up in some little town in Iowa, and he raised St. Bernard dogs as a hobby, and that's where we got Blondine. But Leo Erlep and my dad were teachers out here in the country schools many, many years ago, and so, of course, they knew each other as young people. And I have a old tintype photograph that was taken of my dad and Leo Erlep about 1905 at Niagara Falls. George, you have that photo too. Now, here it says, remember before it said that Otto came down to get a license. Well, what was the license for? Well, here it is. Otto and Dora's wedding in Metz. Otto Grambua married Dora Draber. And I just faintly remember that. Why do I faintly remember it? Because I saw a picture not too long ago of that wedding. And I remembered the big canvas tent that was set up in the Grambua yard. And that's where people came and had their dinner. The dinner was cooked and was served in a great big canvas tent. Then on the first of they apparently went there and stayed overnight for that wedding. It says drove back to Rogers with the Wenzels. Well, the Wenzels were probably out of Wenzel. And then it said Otto and Dora, after the wedding, took a trip to Nebraska. Wow. George, do you know where they went? They went out to Fairfield, Nebraska to see Joseph Johns. Isn't that something? Then on July 2nd of that year, 1950, that said there was a Lutheran Bund meeting. Remember I explained that thing about the Bund before. And then on July 3rd, and it says, went to a party at Detloff's. Charlie Detloff again. And then it says, back home, it says on July 4th, had supper with Martha. Well, that probably is Sister Martha. And it says Eddie drove us down. Well, Eddie was, say after glad he was still on the farm. And it says here July 6th, there was a letter from home, a nice day on the 7th. And it says here on July 8th, the lettuce tastes good, so we must have some lettuce out of the garden. July 9th, there was a letter from Otto and Dora out in Nebraska. Isn't that something? And here it says, went for a ride. This is interesting. With Bertram's to Jameson's. Now, the Jamesons were local people here that I knew years ago. They lived on the farm, which later became the Strike Farm out here near Trout River on M68. They had 3 boys in that family. There was St. Clair, who was the oldest. There was a girl, Arloa, and then there was a younger son, Bill. And Bill was the fellow I think I've talked about before. He was a character. I was with him in the 4th grade, and he jumped out of the 2nd floor of the classroom one day and lit on the ground and lit over the hill. And he was the fellow that I told you about once before, that back in the about 1930, early 30s, when the Spanish War was going, Spanish Civil War was going in Spain. I mentioned about him, I think, in one other story here. Billy Jameson was fighting as a soldier of fortune with the Loyalist forces in Spain. They were being challenged by General Franco, who was going to throw out the old monarchy. And the Loyalist forces had their situation located in Catalonia, where the capital was Barcelona. And Billy Jameson, for some damn reason or other, had become a soldier of fortune, and he had signed up, and he was fighting with the Loyalist forces in Barcelona. And who should come along except another local kid here in town that I knew was not a Linus McLean. Now, Linus grew up just down the street, and he became a saltwater sailor. And he sailed all over the darn world. And I mean that, all over the world. He used to come in and see me when he got back home. And he told me that, and one of the times that he came back in later years, when he came over here at the house and visited, he died here in Rogers City, but he lived most of his life in San Francisco, sailed all over the world, all his life on salt water. And when he got into the Mediterranean Sea at that time, in the early 30s, they were paying huge sums of money for any of the sailors that wanted to take a chance to run the Spanish blockade into Barcelona. And he signed up on a ship that was going to take a load of munitions and medical supplies into Barcelona through the Spanish blockade. This was in the Mediterranean Sea. This was wartime for the Spanish Civil War. And eventually, he said he signed up. He said, gee, he said, the price was so good. He said he he'd come in there another ship, but he jumped his ship and joined the other ship that was going to run this blockade. Came out of Genoa, Italy. Well, he said they finally got through on the clearance, and they ran right into Barcelona with their load of supplies, and of course they were well received because those supplies were wonderful to their cause. Well, they've been sitting out there in that Mediterranean Sea for about 6 weeks, and he said when they got into the port of Barcelona, he said all those guys headed for the closest bar. They hadn't had a drink in 6 weeks. And he said, who in the hell should he meet in the bar but a kid that he knew from Rogers City by the name of Billy Jameson. And he sat right here in this house where I'm talking to you right now and told me that. He said, I was so damn surprised. He said, he said, I couldn't believe it. And here was this fellow, and he said, Linus. And he said, well, I said, Linus, what do you do? He said, we got drunk for 3 days. Can you imagine that? This guy had been out on the line fighting, as a soldier. And they'd given him a leave after being out there for 6 weeks or something like that. They'd give him a leave to go into, to get a rest. And he said afterwards, he said he didn't know whatever happened to Billy. And I don't know what happened to Billy, but Billy was in my class back in the 3rd grade. I knew that. But he had an older brother, St. Clair, who was around here after that. And he had his older sister, Aloha, who was around here after that. But in this reference here, it says Dad went to Jameson's farm. And on the way back, they caught a few trout at Trout Creek. Well, that would fit. Trout Creek, a branch of Trout Creek where he came by the Jameson farm. Now it says here, on the 10th of July, he said, we went to Adolf Bertram's house. Well, I don't know where Adolf Bertram's house was. Adolf was a brother to Bert, and of course we all knew Adolf. But I'll have to think about that for a while. Maybe I can talk to my good compatriot Dorothy Bertram Free to find out where Uncle Adolf's house was. I don't know where Uncle Adolf's house was. Well, then it said on the 12th of July, they went to a missionary festival in Moki. And then on the 13th of July, they planted some peas. And on July 14th was a nice day. There was a letter from Louise. I suppose that was Louise Dramber. And then on the July 15th, went fishing to Trout River. Got 6. Stayed at Cleese for supper. Boy, that was pretty good. And then he said on the 17th, he said he hoed potatoes. It was cool in the evening. And then that's on the 17th, Eddie came down and got us for our vacation. Now, I don't know just what that vacation means, but evidently must have had a few days off. But he said here, on the 18th, he said they drove to Billy Lusky's and fished in Elusky Creek. Well, no. Elusky Creek, I think, is a branch of the Thunder Bay River. I'm sure it is. And they caught 4 trout. And then he said they'd gone out to Metz, of course. They went over to Henry's. They raked hay and hauled in a load. And then they said they hauled sheep to Metz with Eddie. Went to Schultz's in the morning and hauled in some hay in the afternoon. And then they came back to Rogers City. Had a few days off. And then it says here on the 23rd, he said he went to Lost Lake. Alma and the boys. Carl came, brought Martha and Louise, Hardee's, Grandpa, Eddie, Henry, and they caught bullheads at Lost Lake and had a great big meal, and they slept in Art Button's boathouse. How was that? There was no place to sleep, so they slept in Art Button's boathouse. And on July 14th, caught a lot of fish, And then got home at 10 o'clock in the evening. The next day, Osgood went to Chicago. Then on the 25th, he said they went to Rogers Junction to catch the excursion train to Alpena. Well, as I say, those people used the trains, they used the jitneys, they used everything they could. They moved around a whole lot. But there was a ball game in Alpena. But Mother and I went to Alpena. The boys stayed in Metz. Well, okay. Then on July 17th, it was a hot morning. Detlofs for supper. Took some pictures. Now, it says here, the next day, it says Elma came home with the Zimmermans. And then on July 30th, it says drove out to Metz. And then it says here, took in a load of hay at Dramberg's and spent the evening with Grandpa and Grandma. Sunday, August 1st, it was a hot day. And saw Mrs. Split. Now that was a family that was in the Metz area. And on Monday, out there at the farm, they took in a load of hay, picked a few berries. It commenced to rain in the evening, and rained all night. But they got 20 quarts of berries. Wow, must have been raspberries. I don't know what else they would get out there, except they picked 20 quarts of raspberries, a lot of raspberries. Then on the 3rd of August, it said, rained all day. Harry took sick, went to the doctor's in the evening, and got drenched. Must have taken me over to Dr. Arscott's, I assume. And okay, so here we go. On August 5th, it says the mowed grass in the morning. Afternoon, took a stroll in and around. Must have been out to the farm, around Paws. And with Eddie. And in the evening, went to Dramberg's. And then on August 6th, you can never tell so often. It just, well, that was just a part of their life. Those people were very, very close to each other, and they moved back and forth like nothing. And then it says here, August 7th, went to the Drambergs and to the Lagners in the evening. The Lagners were a very prominent family out there in the Metz area next to the Drambergs. And it says Sunday, Alma and the boys came home by a Grandpa Dramberg. Out on door or came by boat. I don't know where they came from, but maybe they came back from wherever they were on their trip. And got a bushel of peaches at $2.66 a bushel. Alma canned peaches the next day, and I pulled weeds out of the garden. Now it says here that on August 10th, P.H. Heft and Mrs. Delgin left for San Jose, California. Well, that was P.H. Heft and Mrs. Delgin, Mrs. Rudolph Delgin, that was his sister. And they were going out there, I think, to the funeral of their father. Now it says here on August 12th, it says Herbert and Irma came down from Metz. Osgood went to Alpena. It says here on the 13th, it says Ossie Bruder, Herbert and Irma, and I had a Spitzer game. William Schultz, George, you remember this, was here from Winnetka, Illinois. Yeah, you remember him? He's the guy we met when we were way out there to Kansas, Nebraska. Aha. And on the 14th, it was very, very hot. And the 15th, there was an excursion to Sheboygan. One of them had an excursion that said one of the boats here, one of the tugs, or one of the little boats, maybe the Gypsy, took a group to Sheboygan. They just go up by lake. It says, I caught four trout out of Trout River. Irma and Herbert went home in the evening. August 17th, Pa and Ma down. That would have been Herman and Amelia. 18th, there was choir practice. August 19th, Bertram went to Alpena. And I fed their chickens. Now it says fed their chickens, and we insist. Bertram's had a little chicken coop back their house. I remember that. And they had chickens in there. Some people had pigs, some people had chickens. But, it was very common. And Bertram's had a flock of chickens in their little coop back there, and he went over to feed them. Nothing wrong with that. Then on the 20th, it says, Glazier, Osgood, and I fishing at Lost Lake. Now, Glazier, John Wing, that would have been one of your relatives. They had good luck. They got a lot of bass, a lot of bullhead, a lot of perch. And so we had a good time. Then August 21st, it says, a very hot day. Elma fixed tomatoes and varnished the kitchen floor. I don't know where we went, but we varnished the kitchen floor. August 22, Will and Adeline Schultz were here. George, you remember that? We visited doing it because Will and Adeline Schultz's house in Nebraska. And they would come periodically and visit. Okay, now it's here on the 24th, it says Osgood to Hanoi. I painted the back porch. And it says Raisky was over. Then on the 26th, it says wrote to Wilson. That would be Dr. Wilson in Detroit about Harry. And then went to a show. And then on the 20th, it says drove by way of Liskey and Posen with Detloff. And then on the 29th, it says there was a mission festival at Metz. And the ministers were Ministers Demke and Baumgartner. Oh! On the, let's see, what is it here? On September 1, it says there was a fire in back of us. Well, which meant that there was a fire in back of the hill. Somewhere up top of the hill, between Roger City and Rikey Hill, there was a fire. And of course, these people were very, very conscious of these fires that would break out every once in a while because of the Metz fire. And there was a lot of slashing in those areas for the burned over timber. And every once in a while, a fire would break out. Even when I was in high school, we used to, every once in a while, kids would go out firefighting in that area. And I mean that. We got a gang of kids together after school, pick up shovels, head up what they call the Churchill Road, which will be right past what we call the Sportsman's Club today, and go in there and fight fires. And then it said September 3rd, there was a Lutheran Bund meeting. A ride to Brado's. The Brado's lived up there in the area around Hallbar Farm. On September 4th, Osgood leaves for the West. I don't know what he's doing out West, but he's always looking for places to invest money. On September 5th, there was a missionary festival at the church. There was a ride on the Gypsy to Calcite. Now, the Gypsy was nothing more than a boat, a small little boat that Heft had down here at the dock. It could probably carry 10 or 12 people. Just a little passenger boat, the Gypsy. I remember being there. But they said that they went to for a ride to Calcite. Well, just a little social ride on a Sunday. Now, it says here on September 6th was Labor Day. Went fishing to Swan Lake for pike and perch. On September 7th, Grandma came down and Irma went back with them to Metz. Now, here, Bengal. September 8th, Alma and Harry to Toledo, along with the Yules. Well, if they went to Toledo, I would probably went down there to see a doctor. They took me down to see a doctor, but apparently this time the Yules went along, the next door neighbors. So, there we go. Now, let's see here. What else is coming on here? Oh, here, it's September 12th. Harry came home on boat. Or Alma came home on boat. I suppose I must have come along. Very rough ride from Detroit. September 14th, bank meeting. No quorum. September 17th, went out to Metz. They were thrashing at Schrader's. September 18th, saw Osgood. And picked tomatoes and cucumbers for dill pickles. And that evening on September 17th, went for a walk with Schmekel along the beach. September 20th, over to Bertram's for supper. People are always going over to someplace else for supper, or they're coming over for supper. And then here, let's see here, Osgood to Alpena on the 23rd. 24th, nice day. Alma was house cleaning. 25th, it rained all day. 26th, Bert was over for supper and did some work on the barn. There must have been something wrong with the barn in the back. And it says, on the 27th, Gladys Rutledge came to work at the bank. Now, she must have been, I don't know where she was from, probably Alpena. Then, on September 29th, Grandma Drambert came and got Elma and Harry. I don't know where we were going, but they came and got us. Well, October 1st was a nice warm day. And then on October 2nd, this is Eddie and Henry came down and went home with them. Had a nice ride. Sunday, Carl, Otto, Henry, and I went hunting. I shot a partridge. Fine time. They were thrashing at Dramberg's. October 4th, went to Rogers by train, got home at noon, so he apparently spent a long weekend out to Metz. Alma came home by train with the boys. Ben, but we came home by train. And then there was an excursion on October 6th to Middlesburg. And then we also went to Cleese in the evening. Well, and then here on October 9th, went to Vital's farm in Metz. Now, the Vitals, I might have to explain that a little bit. Vital was a brewer. He had worked for the Bittner Brewery here in Detroit, in Rogers City. And then after a period of time, he decided he wanted to go farming. And he bought a little 40 or 80-acre farm out there in the Metz area and decided he wanted to raise vegetables and fruits and vegetables and send them by train to Detroit. Well, it didn't really work out, but they remained friends. Now, Mrs. Vital, all her life, and mother corresponded. And I recall that even up to probably a year before mother died up here at the extended care, letters would come from Mrs. Vital. Mrs. Vital, the last I remember in the letter that said there that she was 103 years old. Mother at that time was about 99. And she was living in Florida with her daughter. But as a young girl, of course, she had lived at Crawford's Quarry, and she lived here when the brewery came here to Rogers City for the Bittlers, because he was the brewmaster. But for some reason or other, Mother said, we always kept in touch. And I remember the last letters that I read them because the mother would get the letters, she'd show them to me. Her daughter was living with her. Her daughter was, well, of course, up in the 80s already. But the mother would dictate the letters and the daughter would write. But she still remembered a lot of the people would call them, by name. She said, what happened to the Schraders, what happened to the Drambergs, what happened to Askies and other people that she knew in the Metz area. Wasn't that something? Now, I don't know what happened since that time. I don't recall receiving any communications or any of the letters, because I do know that for several years after Mother died, when letters would come to Elma Grambua up at the extended care, they would send them down to me. But I know that the last letter that Mother got from her, this lady was 103 years old, and she was living in Florida with her daughter. But she still remembered Rogers City and Metz. Now, the Vitals delivered the beer for Dad and Mother's wedding on May 20th, 1908 in Rogers City. They delivered the beer from the brewery in Rogers City. Stayed out there for the wedding. And their picture, if you have the picture of Mother and Dad's wedding, which I have and all the rest of the kids have, I'll point out to you where they are. They're on that photo. Isn't that something? From all those years. But here, back, you see, way back then in 1950, it mentions the Vitals, that they had bought a farm in the Metz area. And then on October 10th, it says hunted until 2 p.m. And then it says on October 11th, a fine day, dug potatoes. And then it says here a little later on, it says, now, this is interesting, October 14th, 1900, married W.H. Whiteley. A very nice day. Was over to Schmeichel's in the evening. Osgood went to Flint. Is that something? I have to call Harry Whiteley about that, George. Now, then it says here, October 18th, raining, very nasty. October 19th, wrote to Irma Johns. Now, Irma Johns, he said he wrote a letter to Irma Johns. Irma Johns was a daughter of Joseph Johns, who lived out in Fairfield, Nebraska. Joseph Johns had two kids with Ernestine Grambua, his first wife. One was Art, and the other was Irma. Irma was a couple years older than Art. And they corresponded with each other. And I never knew Irma. I don't think I ever saw her. She was married twice. First she married a fellow named Jennings. And then I can't think of who the other guy was. It wouldn't make any difference. But then she married again. Now her brother, she never had any children. But her brother, Art Johns, is the fellow that became Arthur McFarland. And that's where this Joe McFarland comes in that I'm corresponding with right now. His dad. And he's the fellow that they're potentially, there's a chance that after 70 years, George and I will meet him in Holland, Michigan, this coming 1997 at the time of the Tulip Festival. He wrote me not too long ago and said that his wife, who was of Dutch descent, always wanted to go to the Holland Tulip Festival in Michigan. Well, I got on the damn phone, and I called him, and I said, Joe, I said, if you and Rose go to the Holland Tulip Festival and tell us where you're going to be there, the date that you will be there, we will meet you there. And I called the Holland and got the address of the only Holiday Inn that's in Holland, and so I sent it to him. I said, we will meet at noon on the day that you set. If you go to Holland, we, George and I, will come and meet you there. Wouldn't that be something, after all 70 years, to see each other again? Because we met originally back in 1927, which is 70 years ago. Hey, boy, that would be a lot of fun, wouldn't it? But Dad says anyway that he wrote a letter here to Irma Johns. And then he said October 1st, he said he dug up the last potatoes and they had a Spitzer game at Bittner's. Oh, he's playing a little Spitzer. October 22nd, a beautiful morning. And Alma made grape jelly. And he said, I piled wood in the morning. October 24th, Sunday, went duck hunting at Swan Lake, shot one. Then went Bertram's. We went to Hallbauer's. Went out to Bertram's. We went to Hallbauer's, and from there we went on to the Otto Wenzel's Poor Farm and had supper. And I have a picture of that event, of that day. Isn't that something? I can send it on, made copies of it, and sent to Helen and also to Dorothy Bertram. I have a picture of that event that happened in 1915. Well, here we are again, folks. Happy New Year, January 1, 1997. Isn't that something? Got up this morning about 7 o'clock. It was still dark. Went over and, after I got up, got the paper out of the mailbox and had my breakfast. Had oatmeal, a little toast, grapefruit, and so I decided, well, let's see what happened overnight. Watching the TV, and there's troubles all over the world, as there usually are on New Year's. There's a terrorist crisis in Lima, Peru. There's another shooting in Hebron over in Palestine, where they're trying to make some kind of a peace arrangement between the Jews and the Arabs over there, the Muslims, and it seems a kind of a never-ending battle. Well, what's on the new? What's up for today? Well, been watching, just watching the game right now. I'm watching a football game while this is on between Michigan and Alabama, and what they call the Outback Bowl, played at Tampa, Florida. Right now, it's just beginning of the game. There's no score. But yesterday, my poor Spartans went down to the Sun Bowl in El Paso, Texas, and boy, did they get whopped. They took them to the woodshed, 38-0 in favor of Stanford. Wow, what happened? I don't know what happened, but I watched part of the game. Almost got to the point where it turned the darn thing off. Well, another year is gone for the Spartans, and Saban, the coach, is going to have a big job on his hand to kind of rebuild and see what in the world went wrong. Well, we'll watch the game as we go along here, and once in a while probably I'll mention as to how things are coming out. And, well, let's see what's else going. A few minutes ago, now this is about 11 o'clock in the morning, Tom Adelsky, my neighbor who has worked for me and has worked for, well, Marion was here too, stopped in, and he brought me a bag of grapefruit, and he brought me a case of beer, Miller's beer. Wow, that'll be good for tonight with a little chopped beef. And but he had to leave right away because he said that Kathy, his wife who works for me, is sick with the flu, and so he wanted to stay pretty close to home. He said he would stop in later on in the afternoon and maybe have a beer with me. Well, let's see what's going. The last time we left you, we were in October 24th, 1915, going through Dad's diary here. That's what we're working on. And so I don't remember just exactly what we were talking about that time, but I think that Mother and Dad and the Bertrams had taken a trip out to Wenzel's and to Hallmore's farm. Then, that was on October 24th. Now it says on October 25th, Mother had a sewing party at the house. Oh, and he said, we had supper at Bertram's. That happened very frequently. 26th, there was a bank meeting, and it was a lovely day. And then on the 27th, it was payday. And then it said here, Mabel Kaiser came back from Alpena. Well, Mabel was a girl that worked in the office, and she appears in here every once in a while. The 28th was a beautiful morning, and the 29th of October, 1915, was a fine day. And the 30th, it was a very fair day, Saturday. Then here it says on October 31st, he says, I was out with Clee and Osgood hunting birds. Oh, it says no birds. But we did stop at Krause's for an evening meal. Well, Krause, I was to say, that was a fellow that had a little store in town, a good friend of the folks. And then it's on November 1st. Elma was at Richards with her sewing club. Now, I don't know that's one of those things that puzzles me. I don't know who the Richards were. There were several Richards families in town, but I don't know just what they were referred to here. On November 2, it says it rained in the morning. November 3, it says there was a Spitzer game at our house. Well, it didn't say who they played, but nevertheless, somebody came in and they had a game of Spitzer. And then it says on November 4th, Brady bought 10 pounds of pork. Now, which Brady that was? Probably John Brady. And then it said we had supper at Detloff's. And then he said, I stopped over at the flour mill. Well, in those days, there were a good number of mills in town. A lot of people had a mill. All they had to do was have a gas engine to drive the gears, and you had a mill. I remember there was a mill right downtown, center of town, where the Standard Oil station was. That was called the Tush Mill. That burned just a few years after Mother and Dad got here. There was also a mill, was Kunert's Mill. Now, I don't know just exactly where Kunert's Mill was located. But then there was a mill also on the corner of 4th Street and Erie Street. There was also a mill on the corner of 4th Street and Huron Avenue. So lots of times people would put up, get the necessary machinery, and then just get a gasoline-driven machine or motor, and they would you could grind flour, you could grind corn, and so when they went to the mill, you had to make darn sure you knew which mill they were talking about. Then it said here that on November 5th they had smoked fish. Well, nice. And then it says here, on the 6th, it says, with Detloff's to Metz to a dance. Well, I suppose Mother and Dad and Mr. and Mrs. Detloff went to a dance at Metz. Charlie Detloff, of course, had a car. Well, isn't that wonderful? Now, let's go out here. Got to skip a few lines here until I get back into where they're talking about here again. And let's see here. Okay, now, on November 7th, Sunday, came back from the dance, and Detloff's had us over. a little lunch. And it says here that Polk and the gang on the November 7th went hunting to Drummond. Now, what would happen there at that time in 1914, there were very, very few deer right around the Rogers City area here because the timber hadn't been cut off yet. The second growth hadn't come up, which would attract the deer in. But there was a lot of hunting that went on in Drummond Island. And there were 4 or 5 fish tugboats down here that would go up, take gangs of fellas, 4, 5, 6, or 10 fellas. They'd leave here from the dock, the fish dock in Rogers City,